to the distinguished co-chair for his opening remarks and for a brief video that he will play. And then we'll turn to our distinguished panel of witnesses, and I thank you all very much for being here. A modern drug cartel runs more like a Fortune 500 conglomerate than like a street gang, with departments specializing in logistics, accounting, recruitment, and chemical science. Cartels manage their empires with deadly sophistication. They operate like enormous businesses because they profit like enormous businesses. Globally, drug trafficking revenues total as much as $652 billion, according to estimates from Global Financial Integrity. Mexican cartels like Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation operate in the billions. Enforcement against these massive organizations usually focuses on their distribution networks, which makes some sense. The product is contraband, and the cases are easy once the drugs are found. But the distribution network is only a part of their operation. They have international supply chains, bringing precursor chemicals from China for their fentanyl mills. They have networks of shell entities and accounts to launder their dirty profits. Both their supply chains and their revenue management operate through shell companies and enablers. This includes U.S. shell entities, I am sorry to say. In 2021, Treasury Secretary Yellen said, I'm quoting her here, "There's a good argument that the best place to hide and launder ill-gotten gains is actually the United States," end quote. Yes, the U.S. has allowed cartels, terrorist groups, rogue states, Chinese money laundering organizations, and foreign oligarchs to use phony U.S. shell corporations in their illicit schemes. These shell companies may exist only on paper, but they enable deadly threats to Americans' lives and security. Nearly 108,000 Americans died of overdose in 2022, according to the CDC. 436 were Rhode Islanders. The death of those 436 people ripples across my small state in a tide of heartbreak. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids are behind many of these deaths. Fentanyl's death toll is the direct result of shell corporations that hide the delivery of precursor chemicals, and shell corporations that hide the profits from sales. One DOJ indictment last year alleged that cartel operatives designed a network of shell companies in Wyoming to launder millions of dollars for the Sinaloa cartel. In another case, narco-traffickers in New Jersey were charged with using a shell company to buy fentanyl-related substances from China, which they pressed into counterfeit pills. The United States recently sanctioned Syrian drug traffickers who used seemingly legitimate businesses to traffic Captagon and launder money. These examples are the tip of an iceberg. While this hearing is focused on the national security and health threats posed by shell companies serving the drug cartels, we cannot not forget that terrorist groups, Putin's oligarch cronies, North Korean operatives, and many others who wish harm to Americans use these same opaque corporate structures. Let me be clear. The network of shell corporations servicing these foes and the enablers who facilitate them are a clear and present threat to our national security. In the battle with narco lords, a little sunlight into the shadows of the dark economy can go a long way. So I thank Co-Chair Grassley for our years of work together to shine beams of sunlight into that shadow economy. Our Corporate Transparency Act is one such beam of light. On January 1st of this year, the Treasury Department established a so-called beneficial ownership register to sort out this anonymous shell company mess at long last, helping law enforcement and national security officials identify who's behind the webs of American shell companies that facilitate corruption and criminality. We can make it no longer true that the best place to hide and launder ill-gotten gains is actually the United States. This year, Treasury also announced proposals to send some daylight into dirty money in the investment advisor industry and in the residential real estate sector. I will be submitting encouraging comments in due course and recommending common sense guardrails also on commercial real estate purchases. It is regrettable that well-paid, white-collar American professionals lawyers, investment advisors, brokers, and accountants provide services to bad actors. Again, this is a national security frontier in the global clash of civilizations between rule of law and corruption. My Enablers Act would crack down on those aiding and abetting America's enemies by beaming some daylight into key sectors like the legal and accounting industries. We can organize our efforts better against the global dark economy. I've introduced a bill to establish a cross-border financial crime center to coordinate across all federal agencies' investigations and information related to financial crimes with a nexus to the U.S. border. Finally, we should provide greater resources to the Treasury Department, the Department of Justice, and other federal agencies on the front lines against financial crime and corruption. Time and again, we have seen those seeking to harm the U.S. use opaque corporations to cover their tracks and evade accountability. We passed the Beneficial Ownership Transparency Law to defend our safety and security against enemies who do their dirty work through U.S. anonymous shell companies. And with that, I turn it over to Co-Chair Grassley.
First of all, I want to thank you for mentioning our working together on this very important piece of legislation. And I wish we could get more out the cooperation that there is in a bipartisan way in the United States Senate, so I wouldn't have people at the back of my town meetings yell out, "How come you guys can't ever get along?" I try to explain to them that we can get along, but I'm not sure they believe it.
Sticks.
Yeah. Congress often talks about how criminals use shell companies to launder money. The Corporate Transparency Act is an important part of that conversation, but it's only a part of the equation. Criminals also use shell companies and muddled corporate structures to secure the tools of the drug trade. Today, I'd like to focus on one particularly troubling example. The U.S. registered planes are used and are a critical tool by the cartels to move drugs. Before speaking further, I want to show you a brief video how the cartels use these planes to cause chaos, and then I'll carry on about that. So let's see the video if we can. I hope this is not an example that video doesn't work.
Drug cartels use shell companies and government loopholes to get their hands on American planes.
But that same open market also supplies a key part of the logistics here. Well, the fires deprived most of this plane of kind of distinguishing characteristics, but you can still see N4 there, N meaning this plane originated in the United States.
U.S. planes are carrying cartels' poison to our shores, killing Americans and causing deadly destruction. We can't let bad actors put our security at risk. Close the loopholes. Protect American lives.
Now, a certain date on April 20th, 2020, Sinaloa cartel crash-landed an American airplane in the Guatemalan forest. The plane was loaded with over 1,600 kilos of cocaine, and that cocaine was destined for the United States. U.S. law enforcement tracked the cartel's movement, and the Guatemalan military sprang into action. The first team to arrive had just 10 soldiers. You know, they were met with a cartel army of 150. This same scene repeated itself hundreds of times in countries throughout Central America, leaving many to wonder how cartels get their hands on American planes. The answer is buried in reams of fraudulent paperwork piled up at the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA for short. Criminals disguised by shell companies dupe the FAA into registering planes with U.S. tail numbers. Those tail numbers shield the planes from foreign law enforcement scrutiny. This allows millions of dollars worth of drugs to sail through the airspace undetected. Once the drugs reach their destination, the plane is destroyed and the criminals walk away with net profits. The FAA is aware of this problem, but hasn't changed its registration process. 10 years ago, we had a 2013 Inspector General report warning the FBI about vulnerabilities in this system. Those warnings went largely ignored. Then in 2020, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, report raised the issue once again. GAO recommended the FAA make 15 corrections to its registration process. 4 years later, the FBI has only implemented 3 of those 15 recommendations. We've all seen the damage a plane can do in the hands of an enemy. None of us will ever forget how airplanes turned into weapons of mass destruction during the worst terrorist attack on American soil, 9/11, as you know. But 23 years later, the FAA still appears to act like a rubber stamp instead of a watchguard. I want to thank Senator Whitehouse for holding this important hearing and our witnesses for being here. I'm particularly glad to have Ms. Rebecca Shea here to speak about what the GAO 2020 report says. Lastly, I want to thank U.S. law enforcement, military, and our allies who risk their lives to keep us safe from criminals. I look forward to discussing how Congress can provide needed tools for this fight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Grassley. Again, I thank our witnesses for being here. I'll give them each a quick introduction, and then you'll each have 5 minutes to make your oral remarks, and your full testimony will be made a part of the record of this hearing. Our first witness, Elaine Dzenski, serves as Senior Director and Head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Ms. Dzenski is a globally recognized expert and thought leader on geopolitical risks, supply chain security, anti-corruption, and national security. Ms. Dzenski was a senior director at the World Economic Forum from 2010 to 2015, where she led the Partnering Against Corruption initiative and launched the forum's Global Risk Response Network. She's held both political and career positions at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, including Deputy and Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy and Director of Cargo and Trade Policy. Donald Im retired from a 32-year federal law enforcement career in 2022. Mr. Im served as an Assistant Special Agent in charge in DEA's Special Operations Division, where he led the Office of Financial Operations, the Middle East and Asia section, and the Chemical, Pharmaceutical, and Cyber section. Throughout his career, Mr. Im supported and led investigations into the illicit financial schemes of the Cali cartel, Asian triads, Hezbollah, Chinese and Mexican synthetic opioid producers, and their corporate enablers. I thank Mr. Im for his years of service and for being here today. Rebecca Shea is a director on the Forensic Audit and Investigative Service team at the Government Accountability Office, where she oversees audits to identify fraud, waste, and abuse across a wide array of government programs and agencies. In 2020, she led a GAO team in examining issues with the Federal Aviation Administration's aircraft registration process, which Senator Grassley referred to, failures that enable cartel operatives, oligarchs, and other bad actors to secretly obtain highly desirable U.S. registration numbers. Ms. Shea worked at GAO for 25 years and holds a doctorate in sociology from Vanderbilt University. Erica Henachek is the Government Affairs Director at the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition, the FACT Coalition, where she leads the group's engagement with federal policymakers. Before joining the FACT Coalition, Ms. Henachek worked with U.S.-based nonprofits focused on advancing transparent corporate governance, accountability, and rule of law in the Middle East. Her work supported the passage of bipartisan legislation targeting the networks that fuel mass human rights violations in Syria and the Middle East, and she campaigned to augment counter-terror financing measures and prevent the diversion and abuse of U.S. humanitarian aid. I appreciate all of you being here, and Ms. Dzenski, please proceed. I would also like to recognize that Senator Hassan has joined us, a valuable member of this caucus.
Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chair Grassley, members of the caucus, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to discuss the Corporate Transparency Act and the important work to abolish the opaque corporate structures that facilitate transnational criminal activity, undermine accountability, and threaten U.S. national security. No financial tool has aided drug cartels, corrupt oligarchs, and enemies of America more than the anonymous shell company. It is the gold standard of secrecy, allowing dirty money to move effortlessly across state lines and over national borders without any risk that the underlying actors are identified. In 2021, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, or CTA, outlawing American anonymous shell companies by requiring all U.S. companies to provide information about beneficial owners, the real persons behind the corporate form. Reliable beneficial ownership information provides a critical boost to law enforcement, allowing investigators to truly follow the money, rather than chasing endless strings of shell companies, trusts, offshore entities, and disguised owners. The CTA replaces the proverbial law enforcement dead end with a critical door to essential information. Drug trafficking operations have long exploited anonymous shell companies to launder money and aid in the transport of deadly narcotics into the U.S. In February 2022, a New York man pleaded guilty to laundering $650 million in drug proceeds through anonymous shell corporations, sending the funds to both domestic entities and foreign entities in China and Hong Kong. In 2018, Chinese national Fujing Zheng and his father, Guanhua Zheng, were indicted for operating a global synthetic drug trafficking organization that shipped fentanyl analogs and over 250 other drugs to 25 countries and 35 states within the U.S., often relying upon shell companies for distribution and money laundering. The drugs sold by the Zhengs are confirmed to have resulted in at least 2 known fatalities in Ohio. For every case uncovered, it is reasonable to assume that there are countless cases where the successful use of anonymous vehicles stymies law enforcement and the case is never closed. In other words, the examples that follow are likely just the tip of the financial iceberg for an illicit industry that is estimated to generate as much as $650 billion a year globally. In Idaho, a victim paid thousands of dollars to an online website called Pharmacy Website that purported to sell prescription drugs. In reality, the pills contained other substances, including fentanyl and its analogs. The DEA extradited a Dominican citizen for trafficking narcotics through the Pharmacy Website, but only after the Idaho victim died of an opioid overdose in 2017. Consistent with what we see across drug trafficking networks, the expedited suspect had used shell companies to launder money from the website. And just last month, a Las Vegas man, Christopher Housley, was sentenced to 8 years for importing, processing, and distributing hundreds of thousands of opioid pills. How did he pay for the drugs and launder the proceeds from their sale? Not surprisingly, it was shell corporations. Unfortunately, through anonymous shell companies, we've tied our own hands, gifting drug cartels and their money launderers a magic curtain to shield their identity and hide their wealth. And the national security risks of anonymity extend far beyond drug trafficking alone. Terrorists, kleptocrats, and America's adversaries have been actively exploiting anonymous shell companies for decades to further nefarious plots and make America and the world less safe. No example illustrates this risk as concretely as Victor Bout, the notorious international arms dealer who was convicted in 2011 for selling millions of dollars in weaponry to terrorist organizations that aim to kill Americans, as well as fuel conflicts in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Bout leveraged an international network of anonymous shell companies to hide his activities, including at least a dozen U.S. shell companies set up in Texas, Florida, and Delaware. Bout is not alone in seeing the appeal of anonymous front companies. Vladimir Putin's allies have used anonymous shell companies to buy $15 million mansions in Washington, D.C., while the Iranian government has used anonymous companies to cover up ownership of a Fifth Avenue skyscraper in Manhattan. The terrorist group Hezbollah has used shell companies to purchase properties and businesses, dodging sanctions and continuing to enjoy access to the global financial system. African dictators have used anonymous shell companies to buy Malibu mansions, while corrupt Malaysian officials used anonymous shell companies to help steal billions from public coffers. Unless the U.S. addresses the risk of anonymity in the financial system, we leave ourselves vulnerable to manipulation, corruption, and attacks by illicit actors and rogue powers. Collecting beneficial ownership information on the companies that operate in America is a straightforward and powerful tool to defend the homeland. There is no legitimate reason to delay the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for inviting me to testify.
Thank you very much. Special Agent M, or former Special Agent M, I guess I should call you.
Retired. Thank you, Senator of the Whitehouse. Chairman of the Whitehouse, co-chairs Senator Grassley, and the rest of the committee. And members of the committee, I'm pleased to appear before you here today to discuss critical challenges law enforcement faces in deterring fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, drug trafficking, narcoterrorism, and other serious organized crimes. Denying the proceeds of illicit activities is one of the most effective means to diminish criminal and terrorist organizations' ability to operate and benefit from their unlawful actions. However, identifying the true beneficial owners of their illicit wealth are difficult when these organizations are able to establish anonymous registered companies that conceal, protect their identities as well as their high-value assets. I retired from the DEA in late 2022 after 31 years conducting and supporting hundreds of money laundering, financial, narcotic, and narcoterrorism investigations. And from my time as a DEA special agent and an Army Reserve officer assigned to the U.S. Special Operations Command, we always encountered businesses, bank accounts, many of which were either in the name of a straw person, a proxy, a front company, or even a registered limited liability corporation, an LLC, with no true person associated with the LLC, nor a physical presence. Whether elements of the Medellin, Cali, Sinaloa cartel, or Russian organized crime, Chinese triads, Lebanese Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, or even ISIS. Each of these entities have used or continue to operate front companies in some form or fashion to conceal their operations and wealth. Many of these are protected and hidden behind a veneer of legitimate law firms and accounting firms in countries throughout the world. In my few years with the DEA, Special Operations Division, we identified numerous online pharmacies shipping real pharmaceutical drugs stolen from thousands of break-ins or counterfeit pharmaceutical drugs repackaged and sold online and shipped through U.S. mail parcel system. Many of these fake online pharmacies have established either a shell company to open bank accounts as well as cryptocurrency wallets to receive payments. The challenges of identifying true beneficiaries of these payments were difficult at best when such anonymous companies operate in both the open and dark web. From 2004 to 2016, the DEA Special Operations Division, with over 32 different agencies, was able to identify Lebanese Hezbollah drug money laundering operations and activities that use automobile dealership companies in the United States to Africa. Legitimate and front companies were used to establish various bank accounts that received and or sent millions of dollars in drug profits throughout the world. Thousands of used vehicles were shipped in false invoicing money laundering schemes to Africa and the Middle East. All the while, the Lebanese Canadian Bank allowed tens of millions of dollars in drug proceeds to flow freely into various front companies and bank accounts controlled by Hezbollah. DEA undercover operations were able to successfully identify these entities in the United States, South America, Africa, Middle East, Europe, Australia, ultimately arresting key Hezbollah actors, drug cartels, money brokers, and coordination with the Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement Network ultimately led to the shutdown of the Lebanese Canadian Bank using 311 sanctions. Most criminal enterprises establish or buy front shell or shelf companies or combined hybrid to create subsidiary companies with tentacles and highly elaborate corporate structures that can also operate nonprofit, social, or political organizations as cover. Thereafter, the myriad of registered entities can access banking, investment, cryptocurrency, and other financial and shadow bank institutions that offer various financial instruments such as credit cards, debit cards tied to bank accounts with an unlimited slush fund, or bank and non-bank loans that obscure and conceal the true beneficiary or the illicit source of funds. Whether for tax evasion, drug, human arms trafficking, or other crimes, terrorist financing, fraud, or government corruption, we have always had difficulty in tracing and identifying the principles behind these activities. Recently, it has been disclosed that Chinese organized criminal networks and money laundering organizations have been successfully laundering billions of dollars of Colombian and Mexican drug cartel proceeds for the past 2 decades using legitimate front and shell companies throughout the world. Currently, Chinese organized criminal networks are laundering billions of dollars worth of marijuana cultivated throughout thousands of indoor grows and farms in the United States. Using trade-based money launderings and parallel funds and asset transfers, these proceeds ultimately end up as either high-value assets, investments for wealthy Chinese government officials throughout North America, Asia, Europe, or bulk transported to Mexico, South Central America, all the while facilitating and amassing the cartel's wealth that allows them to continue its deadly, destructive criminal crimes, undermining the rule of law. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I'll turn next to Rebecca Shea, whose work was mentioned by Senator Grassley in his opening statement, and take the opportunity, as she prepares to deliver her oral testimony, to put into the record the minority report of Senator Charles E. Grassley, co-chair, entitled National Security Assessment, Criminal Exploitation of the Federal Aviation Administration Registry. Is there objection? Oh. Without objection, please proceed, Ms. Shea.
Chairman Whitehouse.
Voice that's going to carry. Oh, thank you.
I don't know who the last witness was, but they sure worked over that microphone.
They did. Okay, am I on? Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, and members of the caucus, thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work on criminal and national security risks associated with opaque ownership information in FAA aircraft registrations. FAA's civil registry is the largest in the world, with approximately 300,000 aircraft approved to operate with a well-known N number on the tail of the plane. U.S. registration is preferred because of the standards for aviation safety and maintenance that support resale value. The low aircraft registration fee, $5 for a 7-year period, is an added draw. But bad actors also appreciate having an N number because it can facilitate flying in and out of and around the U.S. with less scrutiny than aircraft with foreign registrations. Requirements for registration generally involve U.S. citizenship for individuals or corporate aircraft owners, but there are also various ways for non-citizen individuals and entities to meet these requirements through the use of legal structures like LLCs, shell companies, trusts, and voting trusts. While legal, these structures and the intermediaries that help applicants establish them can also serve to hide the identity of the true owner of the aircraft. If those owners are up to no good, investigators' ability to track them down is complicated when their information is unavailable, layered, or obscured. We highlight a number of cases in our 2020 report where hidden ownership was associated with drug trafficking, sanctions evasion, money laundering, and other activities. For example, in one case, an individual under OFAC sanctions for narcotic trafficking used a front man who laundered drug proceeds for him to register his aircraft with FAA. The front man owned 5 U.S. companies, including an LLC that registered the aircraft using a voting trust to meet the citizenship requirements. The 2020 National Drug Threat Assessment noted that increasingly, traffickers use private airplanes and secondary airports to augment commercial smuggling. In addition, aircraft are high-value assets, useful for money laundering, through purchase with illicit funds, and as part of trade-based money laundering schemes. With these known risks and the volume of aircraft involved, FAA has an important role in managing and preventing these risks by verifying the information applicants submit and collecting relevant data to support law enforcement. However, in our 2020 report, we found FAA relies on applicants' self-certification and collects a minimal amount of information. For most registrants, this includes 2 documents, the application form with their name and address, which FAA accepts as factually valid, and a bill of sale for the aircraft. For those using more complex structures like trusts to meet eligibility requirements, FAA collects trust documents stored in imaged PDF files at the time of our review. According to registry officials, their role is to record and maintain publicly available information on aircraft registration. FAA checks that the form is complete and signed and relies on applicants' self-certification that the information provided is truthful and accurate. But if you've heard one thing from GAO and the various IGs in almost every hearing and report on pandemic fraud over the past 4 years, it is that self-certification is not a control. It's a tool for prosecution, not prevention. It shows the person knew they falsely attested to something when they signed. It's not a control to prevent people from lying. And yet, it is the way FAA continues to do business, essentially as a rubber stamp for every application that comes in complete. According to registry officials at the time, they believed fraud was the responsibility of other FAA organizations, and this is simply not accurate. All federal programs are required to manage fraud risks with a focus on prevention. In 2020, we made 15 recommendations to FAA to close these critical gaps in information verification processes. FAA has taken action on 3 related to risk assessment, which is foundational to other recommended changes. However, FAA has a lot more work to do on the remaining 12 recommendations to help prevent exploitation of the U.S. Civil Aircraft Registry for criminal purposes. I appreciate the caucus's interest in this important topic, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ms. Henachek.
Chair Whitehouse, Co-Chair Grassley, and other members of the caucus, thank you for holding this important hearing. I'm here on behalf of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FACT Coalition, and its more than 100 members to discuss the dangers that opaque shell companies present to Americans. Illicit shell networks span states and continents, threatening American public safety and national security. My fellow witnesses have raised how drug traffickers use anonymous shell companies as financial getaway vehicles to peddle products, protect profits, and harm average Americans. These harms are not new, nor are they abstract. The use of anonymous companies has lethal consequences for our communities. The evidence is damning in light of our nation's opioid epidemic. Consider just one case involving a series of pain management clinics in Florida and Tennessee. These clinics doled out medically unnecessary opioids to the tune of $21 million. This criminal overprescribing scheme led to the death of at least 700 people over 4 years. 700 people, and that's just one case amongst dozens where criminals have used shell companies to enrich themselves while exacerbating this public health crisis. Historically, shell companies have made the U.S. vulnerable to financial crimes. As the chairman raised, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said, quote, "There is a good case that right now the best place to hide and launder ill-gotten gains is actually the United States. The United States is a stable democracy and home to the world's largest economy. This means that the United States doesn't just shield the world's worst actors behind shells. In many cases, it promises them the protection of the rule of law, as well as a strong return on their investments." And drug profiteers have taken note. Both down the block and across our borders, drug operations, large and small, rely on anonymous U.S. shell companies. In 2023, 12 people were indicted in connection with the Sinaloa cartel's heroin and meth trafficking operations. The defendants, located in the United States, Mexico, and Canada, laundered at least $16 million through Wyoming-based shell companies. The secrecy afforded by anonymous corporations proves vital for sustaining drug cartels and the violence they inflict on our cities. We also see U.S. shell companies used as part of other crimes that drug traffickers commit to finance their operations, including environmental crimes. For instance, a Peruvian national using the pseudonym Peter Ferrari and his associates allegedly moved billions of dollars worth of illegally sourced gold through the United States as a means to launder drug money, using anonymous shell companies and other methods. As raised by other witnesses, anonymous companies also endanger our national security. One example is particularly striking, in which individuals moved $1 billion in Iranian funds held in South Korea through companies registered in the United States and elsewhere. Decades of U.S. sanctions, and they still chose to move it through the United States. The cognitive dissonance here is palpable. Any U.S. sanctions policy pursued without parallel steps to close anti-money laundering loopholes is at best wishful thinking, and at worst, a farce. We need to correct course. One way the United States can help stop the shell game is to implement the Bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act, or CTA, which marks the most significant update to U.S. anti-money laundering laws in 20 years. It requires certain entities to name their true owner to a secure directory housed at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. Prior to the CTA, all 50 U.S. states required more information to get a library card than they did to form a U.S. Legal entity. Now, law enforcement officers have new tools to follow the money. It's crucial that the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act goes well, and so far it largely has. First, FinCEN successfully launched the database on January 1st, and more than 1 million businesses have already filed information about their true owner. Second, according to a recent poll by Small Business Majority, nearly 70% of businesses that have already filed said reporting was easy. Just 18% said it was difficult. Anecdotally, businesses with simple ownership have reported that it takes less than 20 minutes to complete the form, and filing is free. Unless their data needs to be updated, businesses may never need to interact with FinCEN again. That means that after nearly 20 years of deliberation on the scourge of shell companies, Congress struck the right balance when passing this bipartisan law to keep our country and our region safe, while also keeping the cost to businesses low. Congress passed this law, but now it needs to fund its implementation. Congress should meet the president's request of $216 million for FinCEN for the upcoming fiscal year. Beyond the Corporate Transparency Act, the U.S. must also apply anti-money laundering protections to third-party professionals. If U.S. shell companies are the financial getaway vehicle, then these so-called enablers often provide criminals the car keys and the roadmap that allows them to make their escape into the U.S. financial system. Both the administration and Congress must act to prevent the circumnavigation of our laws. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much. Let me start with where Ms. Hanachek ended, which is dealing with enablers. And if you don't mind me asking Ms. Dozensky, Mr. Im, and Ms. Hanachek each to describe the importance of the role of getting after these white-collar professional enablers in addition to protecting against these opaque, anonymized shell corporations.
Thank you for the question. Very important. So enablers, we're talking about the accountants and the lawyers, as you said, art dealers, financial advisors, persons, professional functions, persons who are in positions of authority with respect to establishing trusts and corporate entities and sometimes serving as fiduciaries. These are the people who grease the system. And that's why it's so important to get to this part of the supply chain, if you will, when we're talking about shutting down this malign influence. If we have people in these trusted positions who are not accountable for the people that they're representing, that's a problem. So we need to close this loophole just as much as we need to establish a beneficial ownership registry. It all works in concert. But without the gatekeepers' piece of this and really going after that through new legislation, we won't have filled all the gaps.
Am I correct in concluding that the professional gatekeeper professions that you just described all operate by virtue of licenses?
That's my understanding.
So these are people with professional licenses who are going about these acts.
Yes.
Mr. M., your role from the investigative side and the role of the enablers.
Well, throughout the years of conducting investigations and supporting investigations, these so-called facilitators are the ones that actually allow these bad actors to reap their profits and continue their crimes. However, the issue isn't really just going after the facilitators, that is going after the bad actors, but the facilitators. In many ways, these lawyers, the bankers, the accountants, and so forth, these businessmen, only get a reduced sentence, a very light sentence, so there's no incentive for that person to cooperate. And when we don't have any incentive for those individuals to cooperate, we can't get to the next level. If we can't get to the next level, we'll never be able to get to the bad actors. And that's always been the issue, is that a lot of the bankers don't go to jail. Accountants don't go to jail. Lawyers don't go to jail. And that's
Many
the
of these
issue.
professionals
Right.
provide services to multiple bad actors,
Right.
correct?
They do.
So if
And-
you could get one to cooperate, the law enforcement benefit would be widespread.
Absolutely.
Likely.
Absolutely.
And Ms. Hanachek, you spoke directly to this in your testimony, but is there anything else you'd like to add after
Yes, I echo my colleagues in calling for this really important reform. I mean, we spend a lot of time when we talk about drug trafficking focusing on busts, chasing after the products, but these aren't crimes of passion, these are crimes of profit. And the best place that we can actually tackle the problem of drug traffickers is to go after their pocketbook. And so it truly is the role of many of these enablers to facilitate drug traffickers and other bad actors in bringing their money into global financial centers, including the United States. I'm thinking of one example in particular from Texas that I was going through Department of Justice press releases recently. And he was found guilty in 2020 of laundering nearly $500,000 a month on the behalf of a narcotics ring, particularly on opioid trafficking. And in a conversation with an undercover agent, he said of his lawyer, one of the dealers said of the lawyer, he's a thug, he just got a law degree. And so there are professionals that make this a matter of business. We all know the stereotypical mafia lawyer, but there are those that are unwittingly caught up in those schemes. And so I think the Enablers Act, which you raised, would do a really great job to making sure that these professionals are not unwittingly caught up in something. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just ask Ms. Dzinski and Ms. Henachek, we've talked a lot about the law enforcement, public safety concerns related to these shell corporations, and Mr. Im is obviously very expert in that area. There's an enormous amount of overlap between the law enforcement national security concerns and what you might call military, diplomatic, or non-law enforcement national security concerns. Could I ask each of you briefly, because my time has run out, to highlight a few of the non-law enforcement national security concerns where important U.S. safety and diplomatic and strategic initiatives may be implicated? First, Ms. Dzinski, then Ms. Henachek, and then I'll turn it over to Senator Grassley.
Thank you for the question. So I think that the place to start on this is recognizing that opacity is the key enabler of corruption and kleptocracy. So when we're talking about challenges with America's foreign adversaries and other kleptocratic regimes, there's really no better tool to exert malign influence than the anonymous shell corporation. So that's really the connection point when we're talking about national security and the ability to use our own system for the purposes of malign actors. It's but one way that it's done, but it's one of the most important. And so this is absolutely critical. When we think about how do we push back against state-sponsored corruption, how do we push back against dictators who are pilfering their own coffers and moving that money into Western financial systems like ours? There's all of this points to the beneficial ownership question and how we close that down. So there's really no way to separate the national security interest from what we're talking about.
Ms. Henachek, final thoughts before Senator Grassley?
I'd only add one particular example that really illustrates this from a diplomatic but also very much military angle. There is a case a few years back in which a U.S. entity was hired on by the Department of Defense as a U.S. contractor. That same entity was later found to be related to folks in Afghanistan, locals that were also supplying weapons to the Taliban, directly putting our troops in danger. So this presents a very real and present national security threat.
Senator Grassley.
Ms. Shea, your team compared registry data to the State Department major money laundering country list and found 251 registrations with addresses located in these countries. Your team also compared the registry to the Office of Foreign Asset Control Records and found 6 planes registered to entities subject to U.S. sanctions. Does the FAA have access to the same records you used to conduct your analysis?
Thankfully, this is working out. FAA does have access to that information for that kind of analysis. It's public information. The sanctions list is public, and all citizens are required to comply with it.
Follow-up question to the same one. What did the FAA tell you about its authority to deny registration to sanctioned individuals and due diligence it conducts?
FAA told us that it does not have the authority to deny registration to OFAC-sanctioned individuals or in situations where an aircraft is sanctioned. I'll leave that, whether that's accurate or not, to the lawyers, but one of the things that, that does indicate is a significant red flag that red flag and a risk that FAA should be managing. And as a result of that, be in very close collaboration and communication with law enforcement about that and OFAC about that, how to be handling that particular issue. And one of the things that we also found in relation to that sanctioned individual, the case there, while there's two different registries, there's the owner registry and the dealer registry, and while FAA had placed a flag for that sanctioned individual in the owner registry, there was no communication between the dealer and owner registries. And the intermediary that had established the registration for the sanctioned individual, who was later sanctioned himself, he was also registered as a dealer. And because there was no connection and awareness on FAA's part, he had registered that aircraft for over a year as a dealer, so was able to use and fly that aircraft, through a valid certificate in the dealer registry because FAA was not able to connect those two data sources.
If the FAA were a private company registering aircraft in the U.S. for that $5 fee, and it failed to check with the OFAC registry, would it be in violation of U.S. sanctioned law?
It would be in violation of U.S. sanctions. All U.S. citizens are required to comply with sanctions designations. And I would also add, if that U.S. company were charging just a $5 fee, it would long have been out of business.
Yeah. I referred to the report that I released, and it's about your recommendations. To this day, 12 of your recommended corrective actions are outstanding despite FAA's agreeing with them. In your experience, has the FAA been unusually slow and dangerously negligent in acting on your recommendations?
So I will give FAA a little bit of grace for 2020. We issued our report and recommendations in March of 2020, but it has been 3 years since then, and they have only completed action on 3 of the recommendations related to fraud risk assessment. That's a good foundation, it's a start, but there are many things that should not have taken as long as they have, taken 3 years in order to implement.
In your 2020 report, Ms. Shea, you noted that the FAA identified a risk that terrorists may access the FAA registry. Could you explain the access terrorists have to the registry as well as their ability to register aircraft?
So one of the things that we talk about in our report is FAA's rubber stamp approach, essentially, to accepting registrations. They collect limited amount of information, and they are looking to see that the application form and a bill of sale is present and the application is complete. They do not verify that information. And in our review, FAA did not mention anything about checking the terror watch list, for example, to identify whether terrorists are seeking to register their aircraft. But because of the approach that they take, the essentially not requiring significant information and the minimal verification, I don't see how they could possibly know if terrorists were registering aircraft in the U.S.
So my last question, I think you just answered, and so I'll make it as a statement. Your report is more or less saying that the FAA hasn't taken any steps to deny terrorists access.
I don't think they would know if they have or have not.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Senator Grassley is interested in pursuing a second round. I just wanted to thank him for his work
Do you want?
in this area. No, I'm good. Okay. And look forward to working with him on remedial legislation, and our appreciation to GAO for all their support as we look at this problem. And with that, let me turn it back to Senator Grassley.
Well, I'll just have two questions then and probably submit some for answer in writing. I got one more for Ms. Shea and one for Mr. M. In 2020, GAO recommended that the FAA create written agreements for information sharing with law enforcement. It's been 4 years and the FAA still hasn't signed an agreement. Why did you make the recommendation?
We made that recommendation based on quite a few interviews that we had conducted with agents in the Homeland Security Investigations, the Trade Transparency Unit, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and even FAA's own Law Enforcement Assistant Unit. And in those discussions, we heard over and over about the difficulties that law enforcement has in identifying the beneficial owner of aircraft that are associated with money laundering cases or associated with drug trafficking cases, and the difficulty that they had with the information that FAA collects that could support those investigations, but also the difficulty in receiving that information from FAA. One of the data points in particular relates to declarations of international operations. With these DIOs, they help expedite the registration for an aircraft so that the owner can take the aircraft out of the U.S. within 3 days. And you would imagine that when somebody registers an aircraft at the same time that they file a declaration for international operation, the DIO, it presents a money laundering risk, and the investigators know this. So these could be very valuable pieces of information to the investigators if they were to receive them timely. It takes a lot of time to identify and trace funds so that they can issue warrants and seizures. But FAA provides them on an ad hoc basis, sometimes, monthly, certainly after the point at which the aircraft has already left the U.S. So that was one of the areas where we recommended that FAA do a better job of sharing daily information with, with law enforcement. I don't think it would require much because there's no barriers that FAA, identified to us in sharing those. They already share them, but just doing that on a daily basis, that was one of the things that we recommended, and it's unclear to us why FAA has not done that as yet.
Well, it seems like 4 years is not a reasonable period of time to negotiate information sharing agreement. Are you aware of any barriers to entering such agreements?
No, not aware of any barriers. Again, FAA did not raise any. They share them on an ad hoc basis, so that means that they can share them. And one of the things that we've also done is added some of these recommendations to GAO's priority recommendation list, so they get enhanced attention. We do a biannual report focusing on a couple of special recommendations, and some of these are among them.
Mr. M., your question is only for comparative purposes to what Ms. Shea has said. You served 31 years at DEA, I believe, and collaborated with other agencies. On average, how long did it take the DEA to sign an information sharing agreement with other agencies?
Less than a year. Some took within a matter of months.
Okay. So did you say originally no more than a year?
No more than a year, from what I recall.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thanks. Let me turn to Mr. M's experience for a moment, also related to, let me make a confession first. I said in my opening remarks that I felt there was more effort against the narcotics empires on the distribution side than with respect to their supply chains or with respect to their finances and financiers. And I will confess that I have been guilty of that myself. I've done those investigations, I've made those arrests, I've made those cases, and laid out the drugs on the table with the guns and the cash and all of that. Even where we did my major money laundering case, it was actually a seizure of contraband from the money launderer. He was keeping assets in gold bars, and we seized all of them. So it was very much similar to what you would consider to be a traditional bust and seize case. I didn't see this was some time ago, back when I was U.S. Attorney and then as Attorney General, a whole lot of infrastructure to plug into if you were a U.S. Attorney or a State Attorney General with criminal enforcement responsibilities to look at the finance side, at how these organizations operated through the dark economy. I know there's going to be a very rough number or comparison, but I would say it's probably 90% of the enforcement effort goes to the distribution element of these cartels' operations, with 10% left for supply chain and finance. Am I very wrong about that? Do you see, has that gone up? Is that an order of magnitude that comports with your experience? How much more room is there for effort on the finance side?
No, that's a good question. Unfortunately, financial drug money laundering investigations have gone down. In the 2000s, it was pretty robust. DEA was seizing annually at least $1 billion, $1.5 billion a year in drug cartel or other drug proceeds off the streets, including removing their assets and even going after banks. However, it just decreased dramatically. I know DEA financial operations used to have a division. Now it's just a unit. Our capability to go after from the street level to even online pharmacies or dark web, and internationally, it's not as robust as it used to be or it could be.
Relatedly, we would see ATF investigations that bumped into money laundering aspects and disposition of finances from the sale of illicit products. You'd see, obviously, DEA, FBI would run into all of this. State police investigations might very well run into this. My sense is there's not a very robust office for coordinating between agencies the various points in which criminal enterprises that the agencies are investigating touch on the dark money, dark economy networks through which the finances tend to flow. Is that your sense as well? And do you think there's a heightened need for interagency coordination around money laundering and the dark economy?
No, absolutely, Senator Whitehouse. We tried that on numerous occasions, even going back to the 1990s, where DEA, using its Title 21 narcotic authorities, allowed for the maximum punishment when it comes to crimes, and attempted to host an interagency component of law enforcement, including the intelligence community, to really identify the big players involved in using all these authorities, bringing in the IRS, bringing in Customs Legacy or HSI, bringing in the FBI, and going after the financial underpinnings of these entities, whether if it was involved with drugs or tax evasion, having that component in like a special operations division at SOD where there's only over 32 agencies. And I had a component of that when I was over there at the Special Operations Division. And I'll give you an example where we identified an organization that was actually purchasing drugs using IRS income tax refund checks. And we expanded it out and determined with the IRS that there were $26 billion in fraud that was taking place using income tax refund. So having an entity working together in a same location, like the Special Operations Division, it can go a long way.
Where should it be housed?
The Special Operations Division has over 32 some odd agencies. It's been there since 1992. Has an intelligence community, has law enforcement, has Five Eye Partners, has Defense Department entities there as well.
So that would be a natural place.
It'd be not only a natural place, it'd be probably the most effective place there is right now because there are also prosecutors there as well.
Yeah. On that coordination question, last word to Ms. Dosensky or Ms. Hanachak, if you care to add anything.
Thank you. Not much to add. I would just emphasize that, particularly if we're talking about solving the narcotics challenge and the connection into beneficial ownership and kind of closing the financial loop, I think part of the challenge for law enforcement is that it just takes too long to get to the bottom of these financial transactions, and following the money has just been too difficult and too time-consuming, and the resources have to go somewhere, and they may go more towards the interdiction than spending the time. So this reinforces why the beneficial ownership information is so critical and why the information sharing across law enforcement, also at the state and local level, becomes absolutely essential to solving these cases quickly and allowing for better interdiction sooner in the investigation process. So it's all related. I think that's the kind of the key here. And based on my experience now going back to the post 9/11 days at DHS, when we were looking for the terrorist threat, the bomb in the box, knowing how difficult it is to find the needle in the haystack, we really have a similar problem around the fentanyl challenge, where most of the focus has been on interdiction. And it certainly needs to be there, but being able to really cut the financial elements of the money laundering transactions and the role of Chinese money launderers in the U.S., how those funds are flowing, potentially getting some cooperation from China at some point would make a huge difference in terms of balancing out what we do on the interdiction side with the front-end work that could stop the flow before it actually hits the border.
I would only add that this brings us back to your point around FinCEN funding. So Elaine raised the need for beneficial ownership information to be a core component of the investigative tools. One of the most important things FinCEN could do is to make sure that law enforcement at the state, local, federal, but also international level know that they have this new tool in their toolbox so that it can actually be used for their investigations. One thing that I'm considering in addition, besides this training element to the beneficial ownership side, is that these cases are often transnational. So we have to think about how information can be shared, beneficial ownership information in particular, transnationally, and what types of trainings are done around that, but also who do we have in place in region that can be supportive to international law enforcement in making these types of requests. We've looked at this mostly around the environmental criminal issue, but also as it applies to narcotics. Considering putting FinCEN liaisons in U.S. embassies might be something that could help facilitate this additional focus on the financial element rather than just the interdictions. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all. Let me particularly thank Ms. Shea. I think your work is in the best traditions of GAO, who we love to work with, and I will be supporting Senator Grassley in his efforts to pursue legislative remedies to solve this problem, and I thank him for his attention here. For the other witnesses, I'll close with my customary observation that we are, as a famous author once proposed, in a clash of civilizations. But I think that author got the boundaries of the clash just a bit wrong. I see the boundaries in that clash of civilization as between rule of law and kleptocracy and corruption. And I think that when you look at the national security dangers that America has faced, whether it be the invasion of Ukraine, made possible by corrupt leaders and oligarchs in Russia, whether it's extremism in the Middle East funded through secret channels, whether it's covert and cyber efforts by China to steal American intellectual property and interfere with American democratic processes, or whether it's international corruption and the various security dangers that creates, over and over and over again, it all touches on a vibrant, secret, dark economy that will help whatever corrupt criminal or whatever autocrat comes to it with money. Very often those are American and European rule of law, white-collar professionals who, for money, are willing to aid and abet the conduct of some of our most dangerous enemies. And we really have to get to the bottom of it. We have to understand that it is a national security danger to our country. It is not just some peripheral thing that happens off in some strange foreign country that we otherwise don't pay any attention to, but maintains fake accounts and opaque corporations and all of that. It is a dark network that supports an enormous amount of really dangerous behavior, and it does it for money. And we need to put a spotlight into it because national security imperatives of our country demand it. And I think the other three witnesses who are here all spoke to that and understand it. And I want to thank you for your work to advance that understanding, and particularly for your testimony here today. With that, the hearing will be adjourned. Do we need to hold the record open for any purpose at this point? Okay. So there'll be questions for the record coming your way, most likely. When they do, please try to answer them as quickly as possible. But for now, the hearing is adjourned.